The storm hadn't yet broken, but the sky was already snarling. Lieutenant Sarah Lawson stood at the edge of the porch, eyes fixed on the tree line that framed the far side of her property. The clouds hung low over Maple Hollow like bruises ready to burst, and the wind howled down the valley road like it was chasing something out of town. Max didn't move. The old German shepherd sat perfectly still beside her boots, rain speckling the grey along his muzzle. His ears twitched, not toward the storm but toward the distance, the barn out back. His body was taut, one paw slightly raised, nose tilted not at the wind but at the earth. "Max," Sarah murmured, "come inside." He didn't blink, didn't even flick an ear. Just stared past the trees. Low in his throat came a rumble, not a growl, not a warning, but something older, a sound more felt than heard. Sarah crouched beside him. "It's just the wind, buddy." But it wasn't. She'd heard wind her whole life. She'd heard mortars in Kandahar and gasping last breaths from a crash on I-74. This wasn't wind. This was something buried, something breathing beneath the storm. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door behind her. She turned fast, hand instinctively brushing her hip where the Glock holstered. No one was there. She stepped back inside, heart just a notch too fast. The storm was pressing harder now, rain slicking the windows, thunder pacing the clouds. On the floor just inside the door lay a white envelope. No stamp, no name, just damp paper and something smudged that might have been a fingerprint. She opened it with her badge. Inside, only one sentence, scribbled in shaky handwriting like someone hadn't held a pen in years. The children still cry beneath her floor. Sarah stared at the words until they stopped making sense. She turned, looked at Max. He was standing now, finally, but not toward her. His body faced the barn again, ears locked, tail stiff. His chest rose once, sharp, and then... He growled, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the floorboards and made the hair on her arms stand up. The kind of growl that said someone is there. She stepped into the hallway, grabbed her jacket and radio. "Dispatch, this is Lawson. I'm heading out. Possible suspicious activity at the Dawson property. No backup needed yet." There was a crackle on the other end, then, "Copy, Lieutenant." "You taking Max?" She looked down. He was already at the door. "Always." They drove in silence. The road to the Glenmore property twisted through dark forest and empty fields. Lightning cracked once, lighting up the trees like bones. Max didn't lie down. He stayed seated in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the windshield like he expected it to shatter. As they turned onto the long gravel drive that led to the barn and house, Max stiffened. "You feel it too," she whispered. The barn stood at the edge of the pasture, sagging at the edges like an old man too, proud to fall. The lights in the main house glowed soft behind drawn curtains. Chickens slept huddled beneath the overhang. The smell of wet hay and something copper drifted through the air. Marianne Bell met her at the gate. She looked exactly as she always did. Pressed blouse, hair in a tight bun, smile too sweet to be sincere. "Lieutenant Lawson," she chirped, holding a flashlight. "You out in this weather?" Sarah flashed her badge but didn't smile. "We got a tip. Said there might be someone hurt on the property. I need to take a look around." Marianne's mouth tightened, just slightly. "We're all fine here. The children are sleeping. Must be a prank. Happens sometimes." Max was already out of the truck, sniffing the air. Sarah stepped closer. This didn't feel like a prank. She watched Marianne for the twitch. There it was, in the left eye. "I'll be quick." Marianne hesitated. Then, "Of course. You can check the barn if you like, but there's nothing there but tools and straw." Max didn't need an invitation. He was halfway across the yard before Sarah reached the gate. "Max!" she called. But he was already at the barn door. He didn't bark. He pressed his nose to the threshold and pawed once, then again. Marianne's voice rose slightly behind her. "There's nothing there." Sarah turned. "You said that already." She pushed open the barn door. It groaned like something old and resentful. Inside, the smell hit first. Hay, wood, oil, and beneath that, something wet and metallic. Max walked in slow, each step deliberate, his head low, ears forward, body ready. He moved to the far wall and stopped. Nose pressed to the floorboards, growled. Sarah followed, sweeping her flashlight across rusted tools and stacked crates. Nothing unusual. But then her boot hit something that sounded wrong. Hollow. She knelt, tapped twice, then turned to Marianne, who stood frozen in the doorway. "You said this barn didn't have a basement." "It doesn't," she replied too quickly. Max barked once, short and sharp like a command. Sarah pulled out her multi-tool, pried at the edge of the board Max had stopped on. It didn't move. She tried another. Same. No hinges, no seams, but Max wouldn't leave. He scratched once. Saturday growled again, low and steady. Sarah stood and faced Marianne. "I'm coming back tomorrow, with a warrant, and I suggest you don't go digging before I do." Marianne's mouth opened, then closed. Lightning flashed outside, and for a second Sarah thought she saw it, the flicker of something behind Marianne's eyes. Not fear, disdain. She turned back to Max. "Let's go." But Max stayed frozen. Thunder rumbled overhead, and under it, so faint she thought it might be her own breath, a sound, not wind, not wood shifting, but something softer, a sob. And Max? He didn't bark, didn't move. He just lowered his head and growled. Not to warn, but to mourn. The barn still echoed in her bones. Even after the drive back to the station, after the soft slap of rain against the windshield, after Max finally settled into his usual spot near her desk, Sarah Lawson couldn't quiet her mind. The floorboard, the letter, the growl. It wasn't just unease, it was muscle memory. Her instincts weren't just whispering, they were screaming. She poured coffee from the pot that always tasted faintly of rust and turned to look at Max. He watched her, not with curiosity, not even with concern, but with that quiet, unwavering alertness she had come to know too well. Ears forward, chest steady, eyes the color of dark honey catching every detail. He didn't need to speak. He never had. Max had been hers before Maple Hollow, before the badge, before the porch with wind chimes and porch lights that flickered in storms. He had been hers in Afghanistan. They'd met in the worst place a human and dog could meet, a crater, still smouldering from an IED on the edge of a collapsed medical convoy outside Sangin. She'd been thrown 10 feet into the sand, helmet cracked, ribs broken, and ears ringing with a sound that wasn't quite silence. Blood had trickled into her eyes, but she remembered it clearly. His silhouette moving through the smoke, nose twitching, tail stiff, paws slow but sure. She thought he was a hallucination. Until he dropped beside her and began to lick the blood off her temple, gently, urgently. Then the barking came, short, insistent, rhythmic. Not panicked, not wild, trained. He was calling someone, and someone came. That bark had bought her 11 minutes that saved her life. They told her later that Max had broken protocol, that he'd disobeyed commands, slipped from a handler's leash, and gone back into the blast zone alone. That's how she knew he was hers. After the war, she didn't request Max. She demanded him. He was supposed to retire. His unit tagged him as too independent for civilian adoption. Sarah had just smiled at the form and said, "That's fine. I'm not exactly civilian either." Paperwork had a way of folding around her presence. Within 2 months, he was lying on her porch, adjusting to Tennessee mornings, still dreaming of helicopters and heat. They had been through 5 years of quiet service since. Nothing major. A missing hiker. A meth house raided. A river rescue when a boy went under. Max never hesitated. He sniffed. He tracked. He waited beside the broken and the buried. But something about tonight had rewired his stillness. There was an edge to him she hadn't seen since Kandahar. Sarah walked across the office and knelt beside him. "You still smell it, don't you?" Max didn't move. She reached out and rested a hand on the back of his neck. His fur was damp from the rain, but warm beneath. Steady. "Wasn't just a sound in that barn," she whispered. "You know it, and I'm supposed to know when to listen." A beat of silence. Then Max shifted, just slightly, leaning his weight into her touch. They weren't partners. That word felt too official, too distant. They were something else. A bond forged not through commands or leashes or chew toys, but through blood and breath and the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask questions. She rose, grabbed her notebook, and began writing. Timeline, weather, letter, Max's behavior, Marianne's responses. Everything was lining up too neatly, and that was the problem. Marianne Bell was the kind of woman this town built statues for. If there had been a list of Maple Hollow's saints, she'd be laminated at the top. She ran the Glenmore home like a charity campaign. Clean porches, smiling orphans, photos at the Harvest Festival. But Sarah knew facades. She'd seen them fall in fire. She clicked off the lamp and stood by the window, watching the wind toss the trees. Behind her, Max stood too. Then came the sound. Not loud, not sharp. Just a whisper in the air, a freight train far off. Thursday, 10:04 p.m. Her eyes narrowed. Max moved to the door without a word. She followed. They didn't drive this time. They walked. The Glenmore property wasn't far, just beyond the northern ridge, past the Miller orchard. The storm had thinned to a mist now, the kind that hangs on your skin like regret. Sarah didn't carry a flashlight. Max didn't need one. They reached the edge of the fence just as the distant whistle blew. 10:05 p.m. Max stopped, head tilted, nose in the air, then down. He sniffed once, twice, then looked back at her, and bolted. "Max!" She climbed the fence, landing in the mud, just in time to see him vanish behind the barn. She sprinted after him, adrenaline replacing doubt. Her boots splashed through puddles. Her hand went to her sidearm, though she didn't know why. The property was still. Too still. No light in the windows, no sound but the fading echo of the train. Behind the barn, Max stood frozen. At his feet was a piece of canvas, freshly disturbed earth beneath it. Sarah knelt and peeled it back. Dirt, straw, a thin ring of rusted metal, a handle. She didn't lift it. Not yet. Max didn't bark. He just leaned forward, pressed his nose to the hatch, and whimpered. It was the softest sound he'd ever made. The sound that had called help to her in Afghanistan. The sound he made when someone needed saving. Sarah looked down. She reached for the handle. Not because she was brave, but because Max had already decided what came next. Glenmore Farm always looked too perfect. The paint on the white fence never peeled. The porch flowers never wilted. The rocking chairs lined up along the deck seemed to sway in rhythm, as if rehearsed. To most in Maple Hollow, it was a picture of charity in motion, a place where forgotten children found warm meals and a safe place to sleep. But Sarah Lawson didn't trust perfect. And Max, he didn't trust silence. She pulled her cruiser up the gravel drive just after noon. The storm had broken hours ago, but the air still held the tension of something unfinished. Max sat in the passenger seat, posture alert, watching the buildings like they'd spoken his name. As Sarah stepped out, she scanned the property. Chickens wandered the yard. A bicycle leaned against a tree. Wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze. And from the main house, Marianne Bell emerged with a woven basket in one hand and a smile that looked ironed onto her face. "Lieutenant Lawson," she greeted warmly. "What a pleasant surprise." Marianne wore a pressed lilac blouse and pearls, as usual. Her hair was tied back in a way that spoke of discipline more than grace. She walked with the confidence of someone who'd never been questioned and had no intention of starting now. Sarah forced a polite nod. "Afternoon. I was hoping to take another look around." "Of course." Marianne gestured toward the main house. "Come inside, won't you?" "The children just finished lunch. I have some lemon tea brewing. Would Max like water? We have a bowl for the pets." But Max didn't move toward the house. He leapt down from the cruiser, sniffed the air, then began walking, slow and steady, toward the barn behind the chicken coop. Marianne's eyes flicked. Just a second, barely more than a blink. But Sarah caught it. "He's trained," Sarah said. "He won't bother your animals." "Oh, I'm not worried about that," Marianne replied too quickly. "It's just old equipment back there. Rusty tools. Best he stays out." Max ignored them both. Sarah followed. The path behind the barn was overgrown, but not unkept, as if someone wanted it to look forgotten, but didn't quite know how to let go. Ivy clung to the siding. A chain hung loose from the barn door, but the lock was missing. Max moved like he'd been here before in another life. His nose skimmed the ground, paused, then lifted. He circled once near the back corner and stopped. One paw lifted, his tail stiffened. Then he growled. Sarah approached, eyes on the warped boards beneath his feet. The wood here didn't match the rest of the barn. Newer, less weathered, as if it had been replaced recently. Marianne arrived behind her, breath just a shade too quick. "That part of the barn's off limits," she said with a gentle firmness. "There's black mold under that section. Unsafe. I should have told you." Sarah knelt next to Max. He scratched once at the seam of the floor. Just once. Then looked up at her. Eyes locked. "Mold, huh?" Sarah ran her fingers along the base of the boards. The grain was clean. Too clean. Marianne folded her arms, still smiling. "This place is old. Needs love, like the children. And like all old things, it keeps a few secrets." Max growled again. This time deeper. Not angry, not warning. Something else. Something that made Sarah's spine tighten. She rose slowly. "Mind if I speak to the children?" "Of course not," Marianne said, voice still honey-sweet. "They're finishing chores in the kitchen." They walked back in silence, the dog lingering a moment longer before following. He didn't want to leave the barn. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of cinnamon and clean linens. On the walls were framed photos of smiling children, holidays, birthdays, Sunday dresses, and painted eggs, the kind of images that earned donors and board approvals. In the dining room, 12 children sat at a long wooden table. Their clothes were neat, their plates full of cornbread and fruit. Every child looked up when Sarah entered. "Hello?" she greeted. They nodded, smiled weakly, then looked down again. Max sniffed the air once, then moved forward, slowly. One child reached out, offering a crust of cornbread. Max ignored it. He walked past every child without stopping, without sniffing their hands. Not curious, not interested. He moved toward the back door again, to the rear exit that faced the barn. Sarah's heart sank. She turned to Marianne. "They seem quiet. We teach manners," Marianne replied, pouring tea. "Respect, gratitude, things most children don't get in foster care." Sarah said nothing. Her eyes swept the room again. Not one crayon drawing on the fridge, not one crooked picture, no jackets hung messily near the door. Everything was arranged, designed, curated. "Do they ever visit the barn?" "No," Marianne said, not missing a beat. "There's nothing for them there." Max barked once from the back door, short, sharp. Sarah moved toward it. "That area isn't safe, Lieutenant." "I can handle a little mold." Max had already nosed it open. He was standing on the porch, nose to the wind again, staring at the barn as if it had spoken to him. Sarah stepped out. Marianne didn't follow. The air had shifted again. It smelled like wet leaves, like iron, like memory. Max paced once in a tight circle, then walked back toward the barn without waiting. Sarah followed. She didn't ask permission this time. Back inside, Max returned to the same spot. He scratched again. Twice. Then sat. Sarah looked around. No hinges, no visible seams, but beneath them the floor groaned with weight it wasn't designed to carry. She tapped one boot. Hollow. Then she heard it. Not loud, just the faintest thump, like something shifting in the dark. She turned slowly. Marianne stood in the doorway. The smile was still there, but her eyes had gone still. "Lieutenant," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now." Sarah stared at her. Max didn't move. His ears were forward, his breath silent. The air between the three of them held something invisible, and it was getting louder. Sarah stood squarely in front of the barn's warped boards, arms folded, rain still slicking her shoulders from the walk over. The air had gone strangely still again, heavy like a held breath. "I'd like to open it," she said evenly, nodding toward the patch of flooring Max had refused to leave. Marianne Bell didn't blink. "I understand your concern, Lieutenant, but that section is off-limits for a reason." "Mold," Sarah said. "Among other hazards, rotted beams, sharp tools. We haven't had the funds to repair it safely. Frankly, I'd hate for you to get hurt poking around something that hasn't been touched in years." Sarah didn't move. "Then you won't mind if I send a city inspector?" Marianne's smile was calm, but her tone turned. "With all due respect, you've already inspected half my property without a warrant. I allowed it because I have nothing to hide. But if you're going to dig up floorboards based on a dog's behavior, I'm going to need something more than intuition." Max let out a low growl behind her. Not loud, just a rumble in the barn's silence. Sarah glanced at him, then back at Marianne. "He's never wrong." Marianne's smile faltered, just briefly. "I'm sure he's exceptional," she said, voice syrup-thick. "But this is still private land, and you're still bound by the law." Sarah stepped back, exhaling slowly. She didn't trust this woman. Not the way her eyes didn't match her voice. Not the way she used the children's names like shields. Not the way Max now stood between her and the trapdoor like a soldier refusing retreat. But she had no warrant. Not yet. "I'll be back," Sarah said, locking eyes with Marianne. "With paperwork and backup." "I'll be waiting," Marianne replied, stepping aside. Sarah turned. Max didn't follow. "Max," she said softly. He didn't move. "Let's go." Still nothing. Then slowly, as if it cost him something, Max took a single step, then another. He passed Marianne with his ears flattened, his tail stiff, not tucked, not fearful, but resisting. Every few feet he looked back, at the barn, at the boards, at her, and finally at Sarah. His eyes said it all. Don't leave it. Not now. Not again. Back at the cruiser, Max paced, He never paced. Sarah had seen him corner violent suspects without flinching. She'd watched him leap into floodwater to pull out a child. She'd seen him lie still beside a dying man so he wouldn't die alone. But now, he couldn't sit, couldn't settle. He barked once, short, sharp. And when Sarah didn't open the door fast enough, he poured the glass with sudden urgency. She let him in. Max leapt to the seat, but didn't lie down. He stared out the window towards the barn. Not blinking, not breathing, watching. By nightfall, Max still hadn't eaten. His bowl sat untouched by the back door, next to the towel Sarah always laid out after wet patrols. She tossed a slice of turkey into the bowl. He didn't move. She tried whistling. He didn't flick an ear. When she knelt and called his name, he looked at her, but through her. Eyes focused on the front door. "I know," she whispered. "Something's wrong out there." Max let out a huff, low and frustrated. He paced again, shoulders tense. It wasn't that he was anxious, it was that he was angry. He scratched once at the door, then sat down hard, like a soldier staging a silent protest. Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, exhausted. The letter from the night before was still in her pocket. The children still cry beneath her floor. She pulled it out again, read the words for the 20th time. There was no signature, no handwriting match in the system, no clear connection to anyone registered at Glenmore, but it hadn't felt like a prank. And Max didn't react to pranks. She'd seen him track a kidnapper across 10 miles of woods. She'd seen him sit at the foot of a suicide call and refuse to leave the body for hours. He didn't operate on guesses. He operated on truth. Sarah moved to the window. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. The barn wasn't visible from her house, but in her mind she saw the floorboards, saw the way Max had pressed his nose to the seam, heard the scratch, heard the stillness that came after. Behind her, Max stood. He hadn't made a sound, but when she turned, he was there, watching the same window, ears forward, still, waiting. She sat down on the floor next to him, rested a hand on his shoulder. "You know something I don't." He didn't move, but he didn't need to. Sarah's breath slowed. Her thoughts did not. Marianne had deflected. The kids had said nothing. The barn had no official records of ever having a basement. No permits, no reports. Just an empty space on the blueprint. A void. She picked up the phone, dialed a number. "Judge Ellison," she said when the line connected. "I need an emergency inspection order, tomorrow morning. I don't care if it's Sunday." A pause, then, "This about Glenmore?" "It is now." She hung up, walked to the door, opened it. Max was already sitting there. He didn't go out, he just watched the night. The wind gusted. Far in the distance, the faint whistle of the freight line echoed once more. And Max, he didn't growl, he didn't whine, but he stayed awake, all night, watching, listening. Sunday mornings in Maple Hollow usually smelled like biscuits and wet grass, but this one tasted like rust. Sarah hadn't slept. Neither had Max. By dawn, she had the signed warrant folded inside her jacket. The ink was still drying when she parked in front of the diner for a takeout coffee, trying to look like business as usual. Locals waved at her from booths. She nodded back, barely seeing them. Max sat in the cruiser, eyes locked on the sidewalk. He wasn't looking for food or attention. He was scanning, reading the world like a code only he could crack. That's when she saw her. Lena, 10 years old, maybe 11. Pale, thin, dark hair, pinned back too tightly like someone told her looking messy was dangerous. She was walking alongside a woman Sarah didn't recognize. Maybe a foster mom, maybe a volunteer. They were heading into the church next door for Sunday service. Lena saw Sarah, and didn't wave, didn't smile. She just paused. Subtle, quiet. Then, as they passed the cruiser, Lena veered slightly off course. A second later, Sarah felt it. Paper, small and crumpled, slipped into her palm. No words, no glance, just a whisper of presence. Lena kept walking. Inside the cruiser, Sarah unfolded the note. 5 words, slanted handwriting, pressed hard enough to tear the page in spots. Please go back. They wait under the barn. Her breath caught. Max let out a low whine. He was already pawing at the door before she turned the key in the ignition. They didn't stop at the station. They didn't radio in. They drove straight back to Glenmore. The sky was overcast, heavy with more than weather. The barn rose ahead of them like a shadow that refused to fall. Marianne was already outside, pruning roses like nothing was wrong. Her pearl earrings glinted as she turned. "Back already?" she called, tone warm but taut. Sarah stepped out of the car, warrant in hand. "This is official," she said, holding up the paper. "We're going inside, all of it." Marianne's mouth tightened. "I'd prefer—" "You don't get a say this time." Max didn't wait for ceremony. He bolted toward the barn the moment the door opened. Sarah followed, boots squelching through wet grass. He led her back to the same corner, the same wrong floorboards. Only this time there was no hesitation. Max began to dig. Not frantically, but with precision. A paw, a pause, a low growl, another scratch. Dust curled up around his legs like smoke. Sarah knelt beside him and rapped her knuckles against the wood. Still hollow. She reached into her jacket, pulled a slim pry bar from her belt. The edge slid into the seam. She pushed down hard. The board cracked, then lifted. And beneath it, a ring, rust-colored, half buried in straw and time. She grabbed it, pulled. The trap door moaned like it hadn't been opened in years. Hinges screamed. A wave of cold air poured up, thick with mildew, metal, and something older. Max stiffened. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stared. Sarah switched on her flashlight and aimed it into the dark. A narrow staircase descended into blackness. She drew her sidearm and began down, Max close behind, his nails clicking against the wood like a ticking clock. Each step creaked. The air grew colder, damper. The smell turned from mold to rot. At the bottom was a dirt floor, low ceiling, stone walls that looked like they belonged in another century. In the center of the room, a chair, bolted to the ground. Its metal frame rusted, but not completely. Leather straps hung from its arms. One was broken, the others stained. Blood dried and black around the edges. Max growled, deep and guttural. He sniffed the base of the chair, then moved toward the wall. Chains, 3 sets, heavy iron, the kind used for livestock or prisoners. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. She scanned the rest of the room. Crates stacked in the corner, an old cot with a shredded blanket. And etched into the far wall, scratched deep into the stone with some kind of nail or wire, were words. "Please don't forget us." Behind her, Max stood silent, not moving, not sniffing, just watching. Sarah took a slow breath, then clicked her radio. "This is Lieutenant Lawson. I need immediate backup at Glenmore Farm. Bring forensics. Bring everything." A long pause on the line. Then, "Copy that, Lieutenant. ETA 10 minutes." When she climbed back up the stairs, Marianne Bell was gone. The porch was empty. The clippers still lay in the rose bed. Max stepped outside and scanned the field. No barking, no running, just the slow shift of his ears. Tracking, listening. Then, finally, he sat. And Sarah knew this was only the first door, and there were others, waiting, just like the children, just like Lena said. The train whistle blew at 10:05 p.m., sharp, same as every Thursday. Sarah stood outside the station, coffee cooling in her hand, the paper cup trembling slightly in the night air. The sound echoed down the valley like a scream muffled by distance. Max was already alert, ears perked, staring down the stretch of trees that separated Maple Hollow from Glenmore Farm. He had moved to the station door 10 minutes before the whistle, like he knew the rhythm of the rail better than the engineers did. Sarah had spent the day tracing property lines, old land deeds, and utility maps. What she found sent a shiver crawling down her back. An abandoned freight spur that split off behind Glenmore, long disconnected from the main line, but not destroyed, just hidden. It ran directly beneath the East Ridge and reconnected with the main network several miles south near an old switching yard, officially decommissioned, unofficially untouched. She dug deeper. Charity filings, non-profit registries, state grant receipts, all of them tied to a familiar name, Bell Foundation. Then another, the Marian Hope Network. Then another, different names, same address. Marianne Bell had built a web of relief organizations across the state. Children's homes, foster pipelines, educational subsidies. On paper, they looked saintly. But the money didn't move like charity. It moved like business, and some of the names tied to these organizations. Missing children, transferred, placed, rehomed, but never seen again. Max paced now, back and forth at the edge of the lot, whining low in his throat. Sarah crumpled the printout of the dummy non-profits in her hand, jaw clenched. She knew where she had to go. They returned to Glenmore under cover of night. No lights in the house, no sign of Marianne. The flowers were wilted. A curtain fluttered, but no faces appeared. The barn loomed silent. Max moved like he was retracing a map in his head. Not to the barn, not to the trapdoor, to the tree line. He stopped at the base of an old oak, nose to the ground, tail stiff. Sarah followed, flashlight sweeping. Beneath the leaves and brush, there it was, concrete, cracked and moss-covered. A slab barely the size of a manhole cover. She knelt, brushed it clean. An old maintenance hatch. Max pawed at the edge. Sarah found the latch, rusted and fused with time. She pried it loose with the same crowbar she'd used on the trapdoor. It gave with a scream of metal. Below, darkness, damp and stale. And stairs. Max didn't hesitate. He disappeared down into the dark. Sarah followed, pistol drawn, heart hammering. The tunnel was narrow, cut from stone and reinforced with timber that had long since rotted. Roots hung down like tendrils. The air smelled like mold and iron. Footing was slick. Every sound echoed back tenfold. But Max didn't slow. His body moved low and fast, driven by something ancient and relentless. They reached a split. Max chose the left tunnel. It opened into a crude chamber dug out by hand or time. She couldn't tell. And then she saw them. 7. Children. Huddled against the wall like shadows wrapped in skin. Silent. Filthy. Bones visible through thin shirts. Eyes too wide. Too knowing. Sarah holstered her weapon, stepping forward with both hands raised. "It's okay," she said gently. "You're safe now. I'm here to take you home." No one moved. Not until Max did. He walked to the smallest child, a boy with matted hair and a bruised eye. Max sat. Slowly he laid his head in the boy's lap. The child flinched, then froze. Max didn't move. After a long beat, the boy's fingers reached out, trembling, and touched Max's fur. He sobbed. Then the others did too. Sarah pressed her radio. "This is Lieutenant Lawson. I need full emergency response to Glenmore. I've located 7 children, alive. We are underground, unknown depth. Dispatch EMS, trauma teams, and child services now." "Copy, Lieutenant. Units en route." She crouched beside Max, whispering, "You did good, buddy. You found them." Max blinked slowly, the boy still cradling his head like an anchor in the dark. Sarah looked around. No beds, no food, just chains bolted into the stone, and a shipping manifest nailed to the wall. Rows of initials, ages, conditions, some marked with check marks, others with XX. She pulled it down. She had names now. This was no longer a local case. This was a pipeline. And Marianne Bell wasn't running it alone. She was only the beginning. As sirens wailed in the distance, echoing down the hollow, Max stood and walked back to the tunnel. His job wasn't done. He turned once to look at her, then continued down the other path. And Sarah followed. The barn was quiet when the agents arrived. Too quiet. The trapdoor was still open, the stairs still damp with the breath of whatever horrors lay beneath. The room of chains and silence had been cleared, evidence bagged, children taken to safety. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Something was missing. Sarah paced the edge of the property, Max beside her, nose to the wind. The sun hadn't yet risen, but light was beginning to seep into the clouds, grey and tired. Then her radio cracked. "Lieutenant Lawson, we have a problem. House is empty, completely cleared out." Sarah stopped. "Marianne?" "Gone. No sign of her. But we found tire tracks. Heavy load. Headed south." Max growled low. Sarah sprinted toward the back fence. Just past the trees, fresh ruts in the dirt glistened with rain. They led to a concealed service road, a shortcut to the old freight yard. The same yard connected to the spur line. "She's moving them," Sarah breathed. "She's running." Back at the station, agents began combing traffic cams, gas station footage, any trace of vehicles leaving Maple Hollow during the night. Within the hour, they got a hit. Grainy footage from a road camera showed a covered flatbed moving fast down County Road 6. No plates, no driver ID, but the timestamp? 3:42 a.m., just after the rescue. Max paced the hallway like a drumline, tail stiff, teeth grinding silently. Sarah leaned against her desk, scanning the updated manifest they'd pulled from the underground tunnel. 6 entries still marked as unconfirmed transfer. A second location, not yet searched. Then came the break. A rookie deputy named Keller walked in holding a printed photo. "This came through the tip line. No sender, no message. Just this." Sarah took the paper. It showed a church. Small, brick, white steeple. And standing outside, handing out what looked like hymn books, was a woman in pearls. Marianne Bell. Same smile. Same posture. But wearing a cardigan and name tag that read, Mrs. Evelyn T. The photo had been taken in Kansas. Sarah didn't wait. They rolled up on the old switching yard an hour later, escorted by 2 black SUVs from the bureau. Sarah rode shotgun, Max in the back, silent and bristling. "Look for crates marked as medical," she told the agents. "She's used that cover before." As they pulled in, movement near the tracks caught her eye. 2 men, one hauling a dolly, the other sliding a box the size of a coffin into the shadows of an unmarked rail car. Sarah jumped out of the vehicle, Max already leaping past her. "Federal agents!" someone shouted. The 2 men bolted in opposite directions. Max didn't hesitate. He lunged right, chasing the one with the dolly, feet thudding against gravel. The man tried to hurdle a crate. Failed. Max was on him before he hit the ground, teeth bared, a snarl erupting from his chest that made everyone freeze. The second man ran left, right into Sarah's gun. "Hands up!" she barked. He dropped to his knees. Backup swarmed in. Sarah ran to the crates. There were 4. She ripped the lid off the nearest. Inside, a child. Girl. Maybe 9. Unconscious but breathing, IV in her arm, a hospital bracelet around her wrist with no name, just initials. "Get medics!" she shouted. In total, 6 children were recovered that day. 6 bodies that had nearly disappeared without a trace. But no sign of Marianne. She was gone. Again. That night, the station was quiet. Sarah sat in her office, staring at the only photo that mattered now. Marianne, smiling outside a church that looked like it belonged in a postcard. The steeple had a name carved into the stone. St. Helena's Fellowship, Cedar Grove, Kansas. It was dated 2 days ago. She turned the photo over. Blank. No fingerprints, no return address. Just the image. Max lay beside her chair, head on his paws, eyes open. Still listening. Still waiting. Sarah looked down at him. "She's changing masks again," she whispered. "But we'll find her." Max didn't bark, but his tail thudded once against the floor. That was enough. The church fellowship hall smelled like lemon bars and weak coffee. Children's drawings lined the corkboard. Smiling suns, stick-figure families, the word hope in crooked glitter letters. At a table near the front, surrounded by a circle of women in floral cardigans, Marianne Bell, now Mrs. Evelyn Traz, laughed gently as she refolded napkins into swans. Her pearls glinted beneath the fluorescent lights. Her smile was calm, warm, maternal. Sarah stood just outside the double doors, earpiece humming. "On my mark," said Agent Rivera's voice in her ear. "3 units on perimeter, 2 inside already, posing as volunteers. Nobody makes a move until she confirms identity." Max sat beside her, head tilted, not barking, not fidgeting, just knowing. Across the room, one of the undercover agents stepped forward with a clipboard. "Excuse me, ma'am. Is your name Evelyn Traz?" Marianne blinked, still smiling. "I am. I'm sorry to bother you, but I think there's an issue with your vehicle in the lot. Would you mind stepping outside?" She rose, smoothing her skirt. The other women looked on, unfazed, chatting over casseroles and hymn sign-up sheets. Marianne walked towards the door like it was any other day, like she wasn't walking toward justice. Then she saw Sarah. And Max. Her steps faltered, just slightly. Then resumed. Sarah opened the door. "Marianne Bell, you're under arrest for felony child trafficking, abuse, conspiracy, and unlawful transport of minors across state lines." Marianne didn't blink. "You must have me confused." "No confusion," Sarah said. "It's over." Marianne looked down at Max. He didn't growl. Didn't lunge, he just stared. She offered a faint smile. "You brought him." "He found them," Sarah said flatly. The cuffs went on. The interrogation room was cold by design. Stainless table. 1 chair bolted down. Glass panel reflecting the hollow shape of a woman who had fooled a town, a state, and dozens of government agencies for over a decade. Sarah stood behind the glass, arms folded. Agent Rivera sat across from Marianne, voice calm but sharp. "No lawyers yet. Just questions." Marianne crossed her legs. "Why children?" Rivera asked. Marianne glanced at the camera in the corner. "Why does anyone do anything?" She answered. "Because there's demand. You weren't just a middle link, you ran it." Marianne smiled softly. "Oh no, I organized. There's a difference. We have evidence." Rivera pressed. "Documents, tunnels, shipping records, witness testimony. 1 girl carved your name into a wall." Marianne didn't flinch. Behind the glass, Sarah watched her movements, too precise to be nerves, too serene to be guilt. Rivera leaned forward. "Say it. Just once. Tell us why. Why them?" Marianne turned slowly, gaze landing squarely on the 2-way mirror. Not at Rivera, at Sarah. And then she said it. A single sentence. Voice level. Cold. "People don't look down when the ground is soft." Silence. Sarah didn't move. Rivera swallowed. "What does that mean?" But Marianne leaned back, folding her hands in her lap like a woman waiting for communion. Outside the room, Max let out a breath through his nose. Quiet. Watchful. Sarah stepped away from the glass. No further questions were needed, because what Marianne said wasn't an answer. It was a truth, and it was more terrifying than any confession. It meant the world let her happen. It meant too many people had seen the surface and walked on, never once thinking to ask what was buried just beneath. Back at the front desk, the phones were already ringing. News had broken. Arrest confirmed. Marianne Bell, the face of goodness, was exposed. But for Sarah, the real trial hadn't started, because finding Marianne was only the beginning. Digging up everything she buried? That would take far longer. Max walked beside her, his steps as steady as ever. And this time, Sarah didn't look back. The federal courthouse in Nashville was built like a fortress, stone, glass, steel. But that morning, it felt more like a cathedral. People spoke in hushed tones. Cameras lined the sidewalks. Microphones reached like arms across the courtroom steps. Reporters angled for a glimpse of the woman in pearls now escorted in shackles. Inside, the air was different. Dense. Still. It wasn't the size of the trial that made it so heavy. It was the silence of the children no one had heard for so long. Sarah sat near the front, Max's leash looped loosely in her hand. Though he wasn't allowed in the courtroom, he'd insisted on riding with her that morning, following her through the lobby and lying down just outside the oak double doors, waiting. Not out of duty, out of something deeper. He was the only one who never looked away. The judge entered, jurors seated. Opening statements came like scripted shadows. The prosecution laid out what they'd found: names, dates, tunnels, photos, shipment codes, manifest lists. And then came the girl, Lena. She stepped up to the witness stand wearing a navy dress and holding a stuffed dog in her arms, matted and missing one eye. Her knees trembled. Her voice didn't. "My name is Lena," she said, "and I remember everything." She didn't cry. Not once. Her voice was small but sharp, a thread pulling tight through the room as she recounted what she had seen. How she'd arrived at Glenmore thinking it was a home, how they were told not to speak, how they slept on cold stone and shared food meant for one. "They gave us numbers," she said. "Sometimes letters. They wrote them on our arms with markers, then put bands on our wrists like hospital bracelets. But we weren't sick." The courtroom was still. "You weren't allowed to ask where someone went if they disappeared," Lena continued. "You just knew they weren't coming back." A juror wiped tears from her cheek. Lena clutched the stuffed dog tighter. "They told us we were special," she whispered. "But not because we were loved, because we were wanted." The judge shifted in his seat. "They called us product," she said. And then the entire room exhaled. Because that word, product, cut deeper than anything. Not victim, not child, not even orphan. Product, a commodity. And no one could pretend it wasn't real anymore. The defense didn't cross-examine. They couldn't. Lena stepped down without a sound. Sarah met her outside the courtroom, kneeling as Lena approached. The girl said nothing, just reached forward and touched Max's head. He didn't wag. He didn't move. He just leaned forward, gently pressing his nose into her wrist, as if to smell for the part of her no one could see, the memory beneath the skin. They sat together for 10 full minutes, Sarah beside them. No press, no cameras, just quiet. Later, one reporter would write that the most powerful testimony didn't come from the witness box. It waited in the hallway with amber eyes and a soldier's patience. Max was never called to the stand. But people whispered about him in every corner of the building. The dog that found them. The one who never stopped scratching at the truth. When the jury returned, it took only 6 hours. Guilty. All counts. The sentencing would take time. More charges were still pouring in from other states. But the walls had cracked. The masks were off. As the crowd spilled into the lobby, Max stood. Lena reached up and whispered something into his ear. He didn't bark, but his tail moved. Once. Sarah didn't ask what she said. Some truths don't need to be repeated. They're already buried in the hearts of those who listened first. The bulldozers came at dawn, engines humming like an ending. Sarah stood across the road, arms folded, watching as the Glenmore barn, once pristine and painted like a postcard, was reduced to splinters and dust. The old floorboards, the rusted hinges, the place where Max had scratched and refused to leave. All of it gone now, cleared, levelled, erased from the landscape. But not forgotten, because in its place, something new was rising. The Max Center, a trauma-informed sanctuary for children recovering from abuse, trafficking, and neglect. With therapy rooms lined in sunlight, safe spaces filled with books and music, and one courtyard shaped like a paw print. It took just under a year to build, but it took a dog to make it necessary. On the opening day, families gathered under the shade of the rebuilt oaks, their children, some of whom had once lived beneath the soil of Glenmore, now running barefoot through the grass. Some laughing, others still quiet, but all free. At the center of the lawn stood a statue, not marble, not heroic in the usual way. It was bronze, weatherproofed, grounded, real, a German shepherd. Head turned slightly, one paw lifted, ears forward like he was listening for something only he could hear. At the base, a simple inscription. He never left the barn, because he heard what others ignored. Sarah stood beside it, one hand resting on the metal back. Max sat beside her, older now, eyes a little cloudier, hips a little slower, but still listening. Always listening. Children approached the statue one by one, some laying flowers, others small notes. One girl placed a tennis ball, another left a drawing of a dog with a cape. Then Eliza stepped forward. She wasn't Lena anymore. She'd been officially adopted by Agent Rivera 2 months earlier. She wore a purple shirt that read, "Survivor? Storyteller," and held a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself. She knelt beside Max and whispered something into his ear. Sarah didn't hear it, but Max leaned forward, rested his nose gently on her lap, and closed his eyes. Eliza looked up at Sarah and smiled. "I'm not afraid of barns anymore." That night, after the crowd had left, the speeches finished, and the reporters packed up, Sarah sat on the bench beneath the old oak tree behind the center. Max lay beside her. Not sleeping, just still, listening to the wind. A breeze stirred the grass, brushing past the bronze shepherd's nose, rustling the names etched into the memorial stones. 31 of them, one for each child rescued. And just below those stones, a plaque for the living, to the ones who heard what others refused to hear, to the ones who never stopped listening. Sarah looked down at Max. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You brought them home." He didn't lift his head. Didn't need to. His eyes said it all. He wasn't waiting for thanks. He never was. He just needed them to be safe. Some stories don't end with a salute. They end with a quiet field, a rustling oak, and a dog whose ears still turn to the sound of a child's voice, even if no one else hears it. Max never needed a medal. He just needed someone to listen. Now maybe the world was finally learning how. What's your story with a loyal pet? We hope Max's journey moved you, stirred something in your chest, and reminded you that sometimes the truest heroes don't carry guns or speak words. They carry pain, track silence, and stay until the job is done. This story was brought to you by German Shepherd, where we honor the courage, loyalty, and instinct of animals who change lives. If Max's story meant something to you, share yours below. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the loudest truths begin with a bark.